But it is always a pleasure to introduce someone like Scott Casper because it requires so little work on my part. Scott is a friend of AAS of such long standing and is a scholar of such frightening productivity that the difficulty lies in deciding what to leave out rather than coming up with what to say. Scott received his PhD in American Studies from Yale and is currently a professor of history at the University of Nevada, Reno, working on 19th century American cultural history and the history of the book. And these are the two interests that have brought Scott back to Worcester again and again over the years, much to our benefit. Scott has held 2 Peterson Fellowships here at the AAS and is a co-editor of Volume 3 of the AAS-sponsored 5-volume series, A History of the Book in America, and is a contributor to Volume 2 in the same series. Volume 3 was published last year, and Volume 2 is forthcoming any day now. He is also the co-editor of Perspectives on American Book History, published in 2002, co-edited with Jeff Groves and our own Joanne Chasen, and is an associate editor with Joan Shelley Rubin of the forthcoming Oxford Companion to the book, forthcoming next year. Scott's first book, which won the Sharp Book Prize in 1999, is titled Constructing American Lives, Biography and Culture in 19th Century America, and examines what the process of life writing meant to Americans from the founding of the nation to the turn of the 20th century. But Scott is here tonight, however, to talk about his new book, pictured here, Sarah Johnson's Mount Vernon, The Forgotten History of an American Shrine. In this book, Scott reconstructs the story of the community of African Americans who worked at George Washington's former estate for over a century after Washington's death in 1799. It's perhaps particularly appropriate to have Scott here this evening, only a week after an event that will probably forever change the way Americans think about the relationship between race and the presidency. So, welcome, Scott.
Thank you so much, Paul. Can everybody hear me all right? Yes, good, okay. Thank you so much. That's such a generous introduction, and I can only say that it is a pleasure and a privilege to be back here at AAS, where I first came as a graduate student 18 years ago. It was August 1990. I didn't know what to expect. I had been told by my graduate director that this might be a good place to do some of my dissertation research. And little did I know at the time that I would keep coming back over and over again, and that this would become in many ways my research home over a long period. 10 years ago, this fall, I was here for the whole semester. It was the fall of 1998, and I was working on a very different kind of project. And a number of the people who were such wonderful advisors to that project and helped me out with that so much at that time are sitting here tonight. People who are still part of AAS's staff or have now retired from AAS's staff, and you know who you are, and I'm forever in your debt for turning me on to what became this exciting new project, although none of us knew it at the time. 10 years ago, the project I thought I was working on here was about how Americans before radio or television imagined the president's family and the president's domestic life. Think about the scene last week when President-elect Obama gave his victory speech and his wife and their 2 young daughters came onto that stage. Think about the fact that in succeeding days, we learned about the possibility of a future first dog in the White House, the possibility that Sasha and Malia Obama will make an appearance on Hannah Montana, and think about the next 4 years when we will probably know a great deal about the Obama family, not just about President Obama. And we can think about similar examples going back at least 40 years to President and Mrs. Kennedy and their children. And so what I wanted to study was whether people in the 19th century knew anything about their presidents' families at all, and if so, what did they know and how did they think about presidents' families and domestic lives? And the answer I kept coming up with was, well, not much, particularly before the Civil War. What did people know about Millard Fillmore's family? Not very much. And what I did find, what I started finding that fall, and continued to find over the next several years, was that Americans knew or thought they knew a great deal about George Washington's family. They created and circulated prints of the Washington family, which purported to illustrate George and Martha Washington and Martha's two grandchildren, prints that went through many different variations and incarnations. There were mother's manuals, guides to how to be a good mother, that talked about how the mother of George Washington should be a model for all mothers, since after all, she turned out George Washington. And there was Mount Vernon. And that fall, here in 1998, I started reading diaries and letters and newspaper articles and magazine articles about visits to Mount Vernon. After George Washington died on December 14, 1799, Mount Vernon became a national shrine. It became a place where Americans and foreigners went to pay their respects to Washington, to pay homage, really, almost to worship at Washington's tomb. And I started finding more and more of these accounts. Eventually, I found well more than 100 of these accounts of people visiting Mount Vernon between, say, 1800 and about 1900. And these accounts got me interested in how Americans made sense of Mount Vernon. What did they think when they went to Mount Vernon? And in many cases, their accounts described meeting African Americans there. And so I found myself asking, what did white people think when they saw black people at Mount Vernon? And that became something I was interested in. And all of a sudden, the project I thought I was working on became a different kind of project. I thought, well, maybe what I want to write is a book about George Washington's family and home in Americans' imagination. And 10 years ago, this fall, I met with a book, which I am happy to say is now in my hands, from the collections of the American Antiquarian Society, a book that introduced me to the central character of the book I would write, even though I did not know it at the time. The book I am holding has a wonderfully 19th century title, The South, a tour of its battlefields and ruined cities, a journey through the desolated states and talks with the people, being a description of the present state of the country, its agriculture, railroads, business and finances, giving an account of Confederate misrule, and of the sufferings, necessities, and mistakes, political views, social condition and prospects of the aristocracy, middle class, poor whites, and Negroes. I'm not done. Including visits to patriot graves and rebel prisons, and embracing special notes on the free labor system, education and moral elevation of the freedmen, also on plans of reconstruction and inducements to emigration, from personal observations and experience during months of Southern travel. Wonderful title, and it probably gives you a sense of when and by what kind of person the book was written. The author of this book, John Townsend Trowbridge, was a New England abolitionist who had been commissioned by a Hartford publishing company after the Civil War, right after the Civil War, to make a tour of the defeated South for vicarious tourists in the North who wanted to know just how deeply the Confederacy had been ground into the dust, and maybe to know something about how the freed people, former slaves, were making sense or making new lives after their freedom. And the title reflects a lot of that. And so I was reading Trowbridge's book because Trowbridge had a chapter about visiting Mount Vernon. And I thought, well, that will be interesting to see how somebody looks at Mount Vernon after the Civil War. In order to understand what Trowbridge was looking at, it makes sense to look at what Mount Vernon looked like during the Civil War. This map shows the region of Mount Vernon. And if you look at the Potomac River here, there's a shaded triangle, it's slightly yellow, right here, which I'm tracing with the pointer. That's 1,200 acres. Those 1,200 acres were owned before the Civil War by John Augustine Washington. He was the last Washington to own Mount Vernon. In 1858, he signed a contract with the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union, an organization of women from around the country, to sell them these 200 acres of his 1,200. These 200 acres are the part that includes the mansion and the tomb of Washington. That is, those are the part that we think of as historic Mount Vernon. But this map was drawn by a New York soldier during the Civil War, a soldier who was also an artist. And when he drew this map in 1861, you can see where the troops are stationed in the vicinity of Mount Vernon. The area of Fairfax County, Virginia, that includes Mount Vernon, was captured quite early in the war by the Union armies. So we are looking here behind Union lines. But during the war, Mount Vernon remained neutral ground. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which owned the place, had put as managers on the place a Virginian man and a New York woman who together kept Mount Vernon neutral during the Civil War. Soldiers might come to visit, and here's a picture from a news magazine of the period, and you can see soldiers visiting Mount Vernon during the war, but they were expressly told to leave their guns outside, and if they were wearing uniforms, they had to cover their uniforms with shawls or cloaks or something, so that Mount Vernon would not appear to be a Union site or a Confederate site. Union and Confederacy alike saw the home of George Washington as sacred ground. Both sides saw George Washington as the national hero. And so, when John Townsend Trowbridge came to Mount Vernon after the Civil War, he was coming to a site that had been spared from some of the hard hand of war. He was coming to a site that certainly was not in particularly good shape because it had been dilapidated before the war and there hadn't been much restoration during the war, but it had not been overrun by soldiers during the war. Here's a bird's eye view of Mount Vernon, created just before the Civil War, in the late 1850s, to give you a sense of what the ground plan looks like. Trowbridge came by steamboat, as most visitors did by the 1860s, and the steamboat landed or docked at Mount Vernon just off the map over here. Like many of the visitors, on September 4th, 1865, the day Trowbridge came to Mount Vernon, like many of the visitors that day, Trowbridge got off the steamboat and walked up a hill to Washington's tomb here. And in his book, The South, Trowbridge describes having a moment of reverence, a kind of spiritual moment at Washington's tomb. After that, he walked further uphill, up this lane here, and then up the lane that leads to these little white buildings here. And he described the area he came upon as a little village. And in this little village, he did something that most visitors talked about doing, but didn't actually describe. That is, he saw black people, and he spoke with a young black woman. And this occurred, right, in one of these buildings, the wash house, where she was, in Trowbridge's words, industriously scrubbing over a tub. And he had a conversation with her, and the remarkable thing is that he recorded that conversation in his book. He never mentioned her name. Whether he knew her name, whether he ever learned her name, we don't know. His diaries of that trip are at the Boston Public Library, and I read them, and he doesn't mention her name in the diaries either. So maybe he never learned her name. Maybe she never learned his. Maybe all she saw was a well-dressed man with little notebooks scribbling notes. And he saw a young woman, 20 years old, industriously scrubbing over a tub. And here's how he talked about his conversation with her. She told me that she was 20 years old, that her husband worked on the place, and that a bright little fellow, 4 years old, running around the door, handsome as polished bronze, was her son. She formerly belonged to John A. Washington, who made haste to carry her off to Richmond with the money the Ladies of Mount Vernon Association had paid him on the breaking out of the war. She was born on the place, but had never worked for John A. Washington. And here, he starts recounting her own dialect. He kept me hired out, for I suppose he could make more money by me that way. And then Trowbridge went into a long soliloquy about how is it possible that a man like John A. Washington could rent out people like this for his own profit. And then she told him, after the war was over, the Ladies Association sent for me from Richmond, and I work for them now, said the girl, merrily scrubbing. What wages do you get? Asks Trowbridge. I get $7 a month, and that's a heap better than no wages at all. She's laughing at this point. The sweat I dropped into this here tub is my own, but before, it belonged to John A. Washington. And Trowbridge didn't quite get her meaning at first, so she tries again. You know, the Bible says everyone must live by the sweat of his own eyebrow, but John A. Washington, he lived by the sweat of my eyebrow. I always had a willing mind to work, and I have now, but I don't work as I used to. For then, it was work today and work tomorrow and no stop. Now, imagine you're a historian reading a book and you come upon this. It was a revelation to me. At the time, 10 years ago, sitting in this room, here's what I thought it revealed. I thought it revealed the way a northern abolitionist looks at African Americans in Mount Vernon. What does he want to see? He wants to see African Americans who are working hard, who are showing that all of those ideas from slavery days were myths, ideas about how black people won't work hard if they don't have any incentive, right? This was a myth, and he wants to expose that myth and to show that former slaves will work as hard as anybody else if they are part of a free labor system, a system in which they can earn their own money for their own work. And not only will they work hard, they will take care of their families, which is why he explains that she has a husband and a son on the place. And so this fit, in many ways, the project I thought I was working on. A project about how white visitors at Mount Vernon look at the place and why. But over the next few years, I started doing other kinds of research that changed the story. For example, I went to the United States Census for 1870, in which, looking at Mount Vernon in the United States Census, I came across a woman named Sarah, who in 1870 was 25 years old, and had a son named Smith, who was 9 years old. Subtract 5 from 1870 to get back to 1865, and you have a 20-year-old woman with a 4-year-old son. Could this be the same woman who was in John Trowbridge's book? Then I went to Mount Vernon, and for the last 7 years or so, I have spent many of my vacations and holidays at Mount Vernon doing research in their archives. And I started with some of their employee records and their annual reports, which listed their employees. And in those records was Sarah Johnson. As an employee at Mount Vernon from shortly after the Civil War all the way until 1892. She had a son named Smith. Her husband, Nathan, was the butler at Mount Vernon. And the pieces were coming together. The woman that Trowbridge talks about, the person he calls in his table of contents, Girl at Washtub, now had a name. Her name was Sarah Johnson, and she didn't simply work at Mount Vernon after the Civil War. She had in fact been born there in 1844 as a slave of John Augustine Washington. And so now I started asking a different kind of question. Can we see Mount Vernon through Sarah's eyes instead of seeing it through Trowbridge's eyes? Is there a way to tell the story of Mount Vernon in the 19th century from the perspective of the African Americans who lived and worked there throughout the century? And at first I thought, no, there probably isn't a way to do that because they didn't leave any written records of their own. And perhaps this might be a chapter in the book I thought I was writing. I still didn't realize that it was the book I was writing. And so I kept digging. I kept doing more research about Mount Vernon in the 19th century. The first question that I needed to answer, I needed to figure out, and it's a question that a lot of people have asked, is, didn't George Washington free his slaves? And if George Washington freed his slaves, how come there were still slaves there in the 1840s and 1850s? And in order to answer that question, it helps to figure out who owns Mount Vernon when and how slaves got there. George Washington died in 1799. And indeed he did, in his will, free the slaves who belonged to him. There were slightly more than 300 slaves in Mount Vernon when he died. About 120 of them belonged to him. Most of the rest belonged to his wife Martha's family. He couldn't free them because they belonged to her family from her first husband, and they were going to be inherited by her grandchildren. So George Washington owns the place to 1799. He dies in 1799. The slaves he owned are now free. The slaves Martha owned, once she dies in 1802, belong to her grandchildren, but her grandchildren, whose last name is Custis, don't get to inherit Mount Vernon. Which means that George's slaves are free. Martha's slaves go somewhere else with their new owners. So how do there come to be more slaves in Mount Vernon? Mount Vernon is inherited by George Washington's nephew, Bushrod, a justice of the United States Supreme Court, and himself an owner of slaves, as most wealthy Virginians were. He brought to Mount Vernon with him several dozen slaves when he inherited Mount Vernon in 1802. He bought other slaves over time. He also, in a celebrated national incident, sold 54 slaves from Mount Vernon in 1821. After Bushrod Washington died in 1829, John Augustine Washington, the first of several, who is Bushrod's nephew, inherits Mount Vernon. He lives only 2 years more, and then his wife is his sole heir. So from 1832 to 1850, Jane Charlotte Washington is the owner of Mount Vernon. In 1841, Jane and John's son, who was known as Augustine, started running Mount Vernon. Starts running it in 1841. He takes over as owner in 1850. And it's really in 1841, when John Augustine starts running it, that he brings more slaves. He brings them from Jane and the first John Augustine's plantation in what's now West Virginia. In other words, to bring this back together, the slaves visitors saw at Mount Vernon in the 1830s and 40s and 50s had never belonged to George Washington. They had not even been the children of George Washington's slaves. They were the people who had been brought by Bushrod Washington, or John Augustine, or Jane Charlotte, or Augusta. They are new slaves at Mount Vernon. Do they tell visitors that? No. Because visitors want to come into Mount Vernon and see George Washington's Mount Vernon. And so if they expect black people at Mount Vernon to be the slaves of George Washington, or the children of George Washington's slaves, those African Americans are happy to play along with the fantasy. Often, that fantasy leads a visitor to give the slave a coin in appreciation for a story about George Washington, or in appreciation for services rendered on the estate. And so what you have here is this emergent relationship between African Americans at Mount Vernon, who didn't come from George Washington's estate, and tourists who don't know that. Here's John Augustine Washington, the last Washington to own Mount Vernon. Now remember that Sarah told Trowbridge that she had been hired out, that John Washington had hired her out to other people so he could make more money by her. And I thought, well, that's a good story. Is there a way to prove it? And reading John Augustine Washington's diaries and letters, we do know that he rented out his slaves, because particularly women slaves and children might be surplus slaves on a plantation. Here's Mount Vernon in 1858. And as you might be able to tell here, Mount Vernon's falling apart in 1858. The balcony here is sagging. Ship's masts are being used to hold it up. And there are people around the piazza, and if we look closer, those people are African American. So in this relatively rare picture from 1858, we might be looking at some of the African Americans who were John Augustine Washington's slaves, some of whom he might have rented out one year or another. And in the process of doing this, I realized I had to start keeping track of who these people were. I had to keep all the names straight. Because eventually I realized there were about 200 people who were slaves at Mount Vernon between 1815 and 1861. And the way I kept track of it was to create my own census based on records from the U.S. Census, based on records from John Augustine Washington's diaries and letters and Bushrod Washington's materials, and just put it all together as a census. And this is the front page of it. I eventually made it into a website because I figured if I figured all this out, I just wanted to get it out there for other people to be able to use as well. And if people come along and know more, I can always add to that. Now, back to John Augustine Washington hiring out slaves. Here's an ad he placed in the Alexandria newspaper, the Alexandria Gazette, at the end of 1857. And this ad is an illustration in the book, and it's from the collections of the American Antiquarian Society, which has the best newspaper collections of anywhere I know. In this ad, Augustine writes, "Negroes for hire. I have for hire for 1858 several women, among whom are a good cook, a good house servant, a laundress, and a dairymaid. 3 girls, one of 17 and one of 13 years of age, accustomed to housework, and one to put out for a term of 5 years. A boy of 10 or 12 years old. Persons who wish to hire any of the above Negroes may do so by making personal application to the undersigned at Mount Vernon on any day after Christmas Day, when they can see and examine the Negroes for themselves." Ads like this were a common feature of Southern newspapers the week before and after Christmas, because that's when masters hired slaves out for the coming year. The amazing thing about this ad is that the only 13-year-old girl John Augustine Washington owned in 1857 was Sarah. So the ad confirms what she told Trowbridge after the war, that John Augustine Washington had indeed hired her out to make money on her. So with bits and pieces like this, diaries, newspaper advertisements, some of the visual materials, a story was beginning to come together. A story about an individual, Sarah, who was also part of a community of African Americans who lived and worked at Mount Vernon in slavery, and then some of them came back to work there after the Civil War in freedom as employees of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, as Sarah did. This was the story that was beginning to take shape in my mind, and that I was beginning to realize was the book I really wanted to write. The tourists would be part of the story, but they would be part of the story almost as much for what they were getting wrong as for what they were seeing. Because the ways in which the African Americans at Mount Vernon were presenting the place were shaping what the tourists saw or didn't see. And of course, the tourists were only there a few hours a day. People like Sarah were there 24 hours a day. And so there was a whole story of Mount Vernon when the tourists weren't there. And I wanted to try to tell that story as well. And so the book was changing. What I was realizing was that Mount Vernon had a 3-part identity. For tourists, for visitors, and for the Ladies Association, Mount Vernon was a national shrine, a symbol of America itself. That's what visitors came to see. They wanted to see an older, pristine America. They wanted to see George Washington's place, his world. They wanted to give a kind of reverence to the founding of America. So Mount Vernon is a shrine. Mount Vernon is also a workplace, a place where there's groundwork to be done, there are crops to be harvested, there's livestock to be fed, there's a mansion to be cared for, and Mount Vernon remains, this is part 3, a home. It is home to these African Americans who work there and who present the place to the public. And once I started realizing that Mount Vernon was shrine, workplace, and home, it became clearer to me how to tell this story. So that we were always seeing Mount Vernon as more than just a national shrine. It was also where people were living and working. People like Edmund Parker, Sarah's uncle, who was brought to Mount Vernon as a 14-year-old boy in 1841. Brought to Mount Vernon as a field hand in 1841 by John Augustine Washington. After the Civil War, Parker came back to Mount Vernon as an employee of the Ladies Association in the late 1860s, and he worked there almost the entire rest of his life. He died in 1898, and for the last quarter century of his life, he was the guard at George Washington's tomb. What did that mean? It meant not only that he made sure people didn't desecrate Washington's tomb, but also that he gave a speech to visitors 6 days a week about George Washington's tomb, the scene at George Washington's deathbed, and the visitors, the illustrious visitors, the kings, the queens, the prominent people who had visited that tomb over the years. Edmund Parker, in other words, became a kind of national celebrity through his appearances, his performances at Washington's tomb. Parker was not alone. Other African American men, in particular, worked for the Ladies Association. He's hard to see here, but by this gate, there is an African American man standing at the entranceway to the greenhouse path. This may have been Sarah's stepfather, whose name was Warner May. It may have been one of the other African American men who worked there. And these were mostly men who had been slaves at Mount Vernon before the war. They came back as what I would describe as the first generation of historical interpreters at an American historic site. And they weren't elite women. They were African American women and men. On occasion, they even made the newspapers. In 1891, the Washington Star sent a reporter to Mount Vernon to cover the annual meeting of the Ladies Association. The ladies, one woman from each state, came together in their council meeting each spring. And a reporter for the Washington Star came to cover the council meeting, and while there, he also talked with some of the employees, including Edmund Parker, and he did a sketch, or somebody did a sketch of Edmund Parker standing guard at Washington's tomb, and the reporter wrote, "The servants are a very interesting part of Mount Vernon. Edward Parker," his name was Edmund, but the reporter didn't quite get that right. "Edward Parker, the faithful guardian of the tomb, has been on the place, man and boy, just 50 years. He was a slave of John Washington, and it was while he leaned against the railing about his master's tomb the other day that the Star's reporter and sketch artist kept him talking while the latter drew his pictures." So the reporter there and a sketch artist. "Massa Washington," and here he's quoting Edmund Parker, "Massa Washington was a good massa as they went in those days," using the dialect that people associate with black people. That was a long time before the darky was thought good enough to get into picture papers. Nowadays, somebody makes a picture out of me every day. That is, they say so. I never sees any of them. They all carries them little boxes with a hole in one end. What's he talking about? He's talking about visitors coming with that newfangled invention, the Kodak camera. But what's wrong with how he's presenting this? He's presenting this as if he doesn't know the word camera. It's a little box with a hole in one end. Edmund Parker had known about cameras for 20 years by 1891 because the Mount Vernon Ladies Association hired photographers to take official pictures of Mount Vernon that were used for postcards and photographs and for sale at Mount Vernon. In other words, Edmund Parker was presenting a very specific image to the visitor. The image of the quaint, black servant who is part of the old days, who doesn't know about these newfangled things. Edmund Parker was presenting a performance at the Tomb of Washington. And many white people who romanticized the Old South, who thought that race relations had somehow been better in good old slavery days, white people ate it up. So Edmund Parker, like many of the other African Americans who work and live at Mount Vernon, is offering a performance to visitors. And it's on that same event that the reporter and the sketch artist sketched Sarah's picture. So the picture I showed of Sarah at the beginning, which is now up again, was published in the Washington Star in 1891. And it's the one picture that we know is of Sarah. So, what is all this telling us? And specifically, what did Sarah do at Mount Vernon? It turns out that in the 27 years after the Civil War ended, the 27 years that Sarah Johnson worked for the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, her role at Mount Vernon was important and became more important over time. Why? She was the only female employee who worked at Mount Vernon those entire 27 years. Other female employees came and went. Sarah stayed all of that time. As a result, she became the confidant of many of the elite white women of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. When they came for their annual council meetings, she was the one who prepared their rooms in the mansion. In the 19th century, when they came for their council meetings, they stayed in the mansion. Each of them had basically adopted a room of the mansion that they were supposed to furnish in colonial style. And they stayed in the mansion. Sarah Johnson prepared their rooms. She prepared their meals. They often asked her about how things were going at Mount Vernon. The person who was supposedly in charge, officially in charge, was always a white male superintendent, but they might ask Sarah how things were really working behind the scenes. And so Sarah became more and more important to the ladies over time. And we can see this in several ways. Not just in their consulting her, for instance, about what fabrics were in the rooms. One of them once wrote to the male superintendent, "Can you please get Sarah to describe the curtains that are in such and such a room? Because men don't know curtains." In her specific words, gentlemen are not au fait at these things. And so Sarah is a source of information for the ladies. And at the same time, the ladies develop a relationship, a fondness, and you might say, in the terms that govern relations between elite white people and black servants, a friendship might have developed. Here's a wonderful picture from the early 1870s of the Mount Vernon ladies in council at Mount Vernon. And you might get a sense here of how they would come together, and here in the middle is Anne, or on the side is Anne Pamela Cunningham, the founder of the Ladies Association, looking reverently at the bust of George Washington, and of course he's looking reverently right back at her. And these women were from some of the wealthiest, most prominent families in each of the states of the Union. And they took Sarah seriously. Sarah's husband, Nathan Johnson, died in 1885. 3 years later, Sarah became engaged to be married again to a man from the neighborhood called William Robinson. And when the librarian at Mount Vernon showed me what she had found in a scrapbook at Mount Vernon, I was dumbstruck. An engraved invitation to Sarah's wedding in 1888. Imagine how unusual it would be to find an engraved invitation to an African-American couple's wedding, and for that matter, to any working-class couple's wedding, white or black, in 1888. And here it was. And it was in a scrapbook. If you look at the handwriting at the top, which says marriage of a longtime housekeeper at Mount Vernon, it was in a scrapbook kept by the vice regent of the Ladies Association for the state of Maine, a woman named Margaret Swett, a woman of great wealth and civic prominence in Portland, Maine. In other words, Margaret Swett was invited to Sarah Johnson's wedding, and she kept the invitation in her scrapbook for years. And that led me to ask all kinds of questions. Not only was this an amazing document, it led me to ask questions about the wedding. Who came to Sarah's wedding? What can we know about Sarah's wedding? And it turns out that in the letters to and from the male superintendent, the ladies of the Ladies Association would often write letters to him, and he would write letters to them, telling them what's going on at Mount Vernon. And over the run-up to this wedding, 2 months before this wedding, we learn about the process, about how the vice regent from Illinois, another extremely wealthy woman who had one of the largest mansions in Washington, D.C., agreed to or volunteered to purchase the yellow fabric for Sarah's dress. And how Sarah postponed the wedding to make sure that the fabric would be there on time so that she would have the wedding dress she wanted. And we learn the day after the wedding from the superintendent in his letters, we learned that Sarah's friends from the neighborhood came about 6 o'clock that night. They enjoyed her wedding. They enjoyed a festive meal after the wedding. And I found myself asking, did Sarah make her own wedding supper? It's quite possible she did most of the cooking at Mount Vernon, or maybe her friends brought food for the wedding. And they left around 9 o'clock that night. We also know, because it's in the Fairfax County Courthouse archives, that the minister of the Black Baptist Church in Alexandria performed the wedding, because he found the wedding license, the marriage license. So what do we have here? We have a woman, Sarah Johnson, who is connected both to some of the most elite women in America and to a local neighborhood of African-American friends and relatives who come to her wedding. And we have a Mount Vernon that is both a national place and a local place, part of a neighborhood. The other story I want to tell about Sarah's role at Mount Vernon comes from September 1892. In September 1892, Mount Vernon was changing. Mount Vernon was changing in several ways. The steamboat, which visitors had taken to Mount Vernon for more than 40 years, was going to be supplemented by an electric trolley, or an electric railroad, coming from Alexandria. And people began to worry. The people who worked at Mount Vernon began to worry that the railroad would bring a whole class of visitors that were beneath the ones who had been coming for years. You came to Mount Vernon by steamboat, you needed to have a whole day, because you had to leave Washington at about 10 o'clock in the morning, you'd be at Mount Vernon at about 11, you'd leave Mount Vernon around 2:15, you'd get back to Washington at 3:30 or 4. It was a whole day event. But if you came by train, you might be able to come, get there fairly quickly, and then leave in a couple hours. And instead of there being one steamboat that came in at 11 in the morning, arrived at 11 in the morning, and left at 2 in the afternoon, there would be trains arriving every hour on the hour from about 10 o'clock in the morning until about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. In other words, visitors would be coming all day, there would be more of them, and they might be of a social class that the management was less comfortable with. And in September 1892, specifically the third week of September 1892, all of these things come together. That's the week the electric trolley begins its runs from Alexandria to Mount Vernon. It's also the week that the Grand Army of the Republic, the Association of Union War Veterans, has its massive convention in Washington, D.C. Hundreds of thousands of veterans come to Washington. And in that 1 week, 30,000 visitors come to Mount Vernon. It was the most visitors Mount Vernon had ever had in a week up to that point. And on Monday, everything seemed fine. On Monday, the superintendent wrote in his diary, "Great day," with 3 exclamation points. 6,000 or 7,000 people had come. It had been a beautiful day. The people had navigated around the grounds pretty successfully. Wednesday was a different story. Wednesday it rained all day. And as a result, people were sloshing mud all over Mount Vernon. By the end of the day, as the superintendent put it in his diary, Mount Vernon looked like a veritable hog pen. This was an extreme, but it was an extreme that seemed like a portent of the future. Imagine a Mount Vernon where there would always be many more tourists than there had been before. Not 30,000 in a week, but more than before. Imagine a Mount Vernon where tourists were coming from early-ish in the morning until the end of the day. How would people like Sarah Johnson and Edmund Parker and the other African-American employees do the work of cleaning the house and straightening up the grounds? They used to be able to do that in all the hours when visitors weren't there. But now visitors were going to be there more and more hours. It looked as though Mount Vernon would need a second workforce to do the groundskeeping work that the one workforce had done before, along with presenting Mount Vernon. And for somebody like Sarah Johnson, who lived in one of those little white buildings that we saw at the beginning, right near the mansion, the increasing number of visitors might mean a decreasing amount of privacy for her. Even in 1891, when the newspaper reporter came to Mount Vernon, he said this about Sarah's house. He said, visitors enjoy peeping into her cabin as one of the curiosities of the place. Now, imagine that you're Sarah, with people always peeping into your house. And so, a week after the streetcars started running, a week after the Grand Army of the Republic left, Sarah resigned her position and turned in her keys. She had been fixing to go for about 2 years. She had talked about leaving 2 years earlier. The ladies had convinced her to stay by giving her a raise from $20 a week to $20 a month to $30 a month, which was a good salary in that neighborhood at the time. And they had given her a vacation, and they had authorized her to have an assistant. But she was still overworked. She was tired. By this point, she was a grandmother, and she wanted to retire. And so she turned in her keys, and the superintendent of Mount Vernon advertised for a new housekeeper at Mount Vernon, and in his letter to a newspaper for the advertisement, he wrote, "I'm looking for a woman," and above the word woman, he put in the word white. And so an era at Mount Vernon, an era in which African Americans were the people who tended Mount Vernon, who tended to visitors, that era was coming to an end, as the people who would be most likely to interact with visitors would become increasingly white people, except for the guard at Washington's tomb, a position that remained the province of African American men all the way until 1965. What had Sarah meant to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association? The year after she retired, they paid a tribute to her in their minutes, and here's how it goes. When this council assembled in Mount Vernon, this is 1893, the ladies missed the familiar face and pleasant greeting of Sarah Johnson, their old servant who, after a service of 30 years at Mount Vernon, has voluntarily severed this long-existing connection with the old place and gone to her farm nearby, much to the regret of her employers. A descendant of the family servants of George Washington's household, she was a fitting head to the Mount Vernon servants of today, and as housekeeper of its venerable mansion, was most efficient and most valuable in ministering to the comfort of the ladies when at council. She obeyed to the letter, during the interim of council, all instructions given for the care of the various rooms, the linen, silver, brasses, etc. The ladies in council offer this tribute to her fidelity and integrity, with many good wishes for her prosperity. Quite a tribute by an association like the Mount Vernon Ladies Association to an African-American woman. Sure, it got her lineage wrong. She was not a descendant of the family servants of General Washington's household. That shows maybe how well she played her part for so many years. But the ladies respected Sarah for her integrity, for her fidelity, for the part she had played, the role she had played at Mount Vernon. Within the boundaries of racial relations in the 1890s, Sarah had developed friendships with a number of these women. And for years after she retired, she would come back to Mount Vernon once a year to work for the ladies during their council meeting. For some of those years, she ran the kitchen during their council meeting. It was a way to get reacquainted with women she had gotten to know over the years. It was also a way to make a very nice chunk of money for a week's work. But by 1906 and 1907, those annual trips back for council stopped. Sarah stops appearing in Mount Vernon's list of employees for council, the people they'd hired especially for that week. And by then, many of the women Sarah had known among the ladies were themselves dying. And so Sarah seems to have lost some of her connection to Mount Vernon after 1907 and 1908. In January of 1920, several of Sarah's friends came to the superintendent of Mount Vernon, the same man who had been the superintendent since 1885, and they told him that Sarah was ill, probably dying. And they asked if there was anything that he or the ladies could do for Sarah in what would likely be her final illness. We don't know what, if anything, they did to help her become more comfortable in her final illness. We do know that she died in Freedman's Hospital, which is now Howard University Hospital in Washington, D.C., on January 25th, 1920. We also know that when she died, the superintendent ordered the flag at Mount Vernon to be flown at half-mast in her honor. An honor that was accorded to presidents of the United States and ladies of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Another amazing tribute, and that's the anecdote, that flag flying at half-mast in 1920. That's the anecdote with which I begin the book, because to me, that says a lot and raises all the questions. How is it that the flag at Mount Vernon is being flown at half-mast in 1920, during the Jim Crow era of segregation in America? How is it that that's happening at Mount Vernon? Who was this person, and what was the community that she was a part of? So, what does this all tell us? If we look at that picture again, right here in the picture, behind these nicely dressed men and women of the GAR, there is an African American woman. We don't know if it's Sarah. There's no way to know. It could be one of the day employees that were hired for that week when they knew there were going to be so many people there. But it gives you a sense of how you've got to look for African Americans in a story that's so often told by and about white people. And this picture symbolizes that. They're often in the background or the margins of the pictures, just as they are in a sentence of a letter that's about something else. And by looking at all of those pictures and at those sentences, the story begins to come together. So, what might we draw from this? What larger stories about American history can we draw from this? I want to leave you with three thoughts. First thought is this. As I worked on this book, I realized that I was telling an alternative history of American historic preservation. When we think about historic preservation, we often think about the people who purchased places like Mount Vernon in order to save them. In order to save them from falling apart, or in order to save them from speculators who will try to make them into money-catching places, try to make them into theme parks. So the story of American historic preservation, as we usually hear it, is about elite white people who save places in from the past. The alternative history of American historic preservation that I realized I was telling was a story about the people who are on the ground making that process happen. And in the case of Mount Vernon, those people were on the ground making it happen before the Ladies Association ever took over. They were the slaves who belonged to Jane Charlotte Washington and John Augustine Washington, who showed visitors around the place even before the ladies bought it. Some of them came back to work as the first generation of historic interpreters, and they were also tending the grounds, doing the housekeeping, doing the day-to-day stuff that made Mount Vernon work. Every historic site in America, I think, has a story like this. A story that's not just a story of the people who saved it from ruin, but the people who, day after day, on the ground, did the work of explaining it to visitors and keeping it in shape. And those people, and this is the second part of my story, or second reason I think this is important, and those people had lives of their own, families of their own, and communities of their own. Mount Vernon might be a national shrine. Mount Vernon is a national shrine. Mount Vernon is also a local place. It is part of a neighborhood. It is part of a community that stretched all the way to Alexandria, in which the same roads the tourists took to get there were the roads that African American employees might use to go do their shopping or go to church. But of course, African Americans also knew other byways that the tourists didn't, just as they knew a Mount Vernon that the tourists didn't. So places that we think of as national shrines also have very local histories. And by looking at the people who live and work there, we can connect them to those local histories. And the third piece, the third thing that I think this tells us about American history and American historic places goes something like this. When we look at Mount Vernon, we think of it as being frozen in time. And that time is the 1790s, when George Washington lived there. And that's true of most historic sites. When we think of Bunker Hill, we think of the Revolutionary War. When we think of Graceland, we think of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. And we often think that when the historic moment ended, when the revolution was over, when George Washington died, or when Elvis died, if you're really sure he did, the place became frozen in time. And in many places, it is preserved to convey that impression, to convey the impression that it is frozen in time. But what I came to realize as I dug into this story and did my research and wrote this book is that places like Mount Vernon don't freeze time once the great man dies. Life continues there. People continue to live there and work there. And if you look into their lives and their work, what you find is that those places might be microcosms of the America that is changing all around them. An America in which, for example, enslaved people wanted to be free and then, in freedom, were proud to earn their own money, to send their children to school, and ultimately to buy land of their own, as Sarah herself did. These are places where the history that's going on all around Mount Vernon, all over the United States, is actually taking place at Mount Vernon too. But that's a history that tourists don't see because they don't want to see that, for the most part. They want to see the place frozen in time. John Townsend Trowbridge, to bring us back to the book that got it all started. John Townsend Trowbridge was unusual as tourists at Mount Vernon went. He wanted to see a changing Mount Vernon. He wanted to see a Mount Vernon where black people were now working for their own income, industriously, happily. Most visitors didn't see Mount Vernon that way. And what I wanted to do in this book was open up the story of Mount Vernon so that we